The man does not scream when the blade opens his throat. He cannot. The cut has already changed the physics of his body. Air escapes through the new wound under his jaw. Blood pressure collapses, and the sound that should have been terror becomes only a wet failure of breath in the driest desert on Earth. That is where this story begins. Not with flags, not with speeches, not with patriotic maps in school books. It begins with a piece of curved steel and the intimate distance at which one human being decides to tear another apart. They called it the corvo, a farm knife, a laborer's tool, a poor man's blade. But in the War of the Pacific, that humble, crooked piece of metal became something else entirely. It became a psychological weapon, a rumor, a black legend, the devil's fang. And once men on the Peruvian and Bolivian side understood what it did in a trench on a slope inside a fortification too narrow for long rifles, they no longer feared only defeat. They feared being caught alive at arm's reach by men who preferred that knife to the bayonet, and who, once the bullets ran out, seemed to become more dangerous instead of less. To understand why a war over territory could descend into something so raw and close, you have to begin with what that territory meant. This was not a conflict about abstract prestige. It was about saltpeter nitrates, the white mineral wealth of the desert that fertilized European agriculture and fed the global gunpowder economy. In the late 19th century, before synthetic substitutes changed the world, this was strategic material in the purest sense: wealth, export power, industrial leverage, military relevance, all crystallized in the dry northern lands between Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. The spark, as the transcript says, looked almost absurd on paper, a 10-cent tax dispute tied to Chilean companies operating in Antofagasta. But history is full of wars where the number that starts everything is tiny compared with the structure already waiting beneath it. Those 10 cents landed on decades of tension: commercial rivalry, disputed frontiers, foreign investment, state weakness, oligarchic appetite, and the unstable pride of countries still defining themselves through territory. When Bolivia moved against Chilean assets, Chile did not answer with prolonged legalism. It answered with occupation. On February 14, 1879, Chilean troops landed at Antofagasta without resistance. The police action was easy. The real war was still sleeping in the north, and in Chile, while ministers and admirals studied charts and tonnage, another kind of preparation was already underway below the level of official doctrine. That is one of the most important points in the transcript. The soldiers who would carry much of this war were not aristocratic professionals shaped in European academy fashion. They were rotos laborers, miners, peasants, dock workers, rough men from the underside of Chilean society. Many had lived with violence, deprivation, and bodily risk long before they ever wore a uniform. They were not elegant. They were not well drilled at first. Some barely knew proper marching form. Many had little interest in the theatrical rituals of barracks obedience. But they carried at the waist a tool they already trusted with their lives and labor. The corvo was not some exotic military invention distributed from above. It was already in the hand, already in the gesture, already in the muscle memory of cutting, chopping, gutting, surviving. That matters because armies are most frightening when they do not merely receive a weapon, but bring a relationship to it from civilian life into war. The Chilean officer corps saw the problem and the opportunity at the same time. On the one hand, this looked barbaric. If Chile wanted to present itself as a modern, disciplined republic, fighting like a civilized army, something closer to the admired Prussian model, then encouraging troops to rely on a hooked peasant knife in close combat seemed almost embarrassing. On the other hand, battlefield reality has a way of humiliating aesthetic scruples. Officers noticed that many of these men did not like the bayonet. They found it too long, too rigid, too awkward, too dependent on formation and space. The corvo, by contrast, fit the body and the brawl. The transcript captures the essential detail. Well, this was not a clean stabbing blade. It curved inward sharply, almost like a claw or fang. A straight knife penetrates and withdraws. The corvo catches. It hooks muscle ribs, clavicle neck, belly. It was designed less to puncture than to rip. In a trench or scramble, with no room to fence properly, that distinction is everything. Chilean command eventually made the only decision a state at total war often makes when forced to choose between appearance and lethality. It allowed the blade. Civilization could wait. Victory came first. Thousands would pay for that decision with bodies opened at distances so close, no battlefield speech could beautify what was happening. On the other side, the alliance of Peru and Bolivia had reasons for confidence. They possessed numerical strength, defensive depth, powerful ships such as the Huáscar, and the geographic advantage of fighting across terrain. The Chileans had to enter and sustain from a long distance. But confidence in war often depends on what you imagine the enemy to be. Many Allied soldiers were told the Chileans were cowards, that they would break under fire, that whatever brutality they possessed was the roughness of a poor country rather than a military principle. No one adequately explained what would happen when rifle lines collapsed into 1 meter killing space, and the men climbing the trench lip preferred a curved knife to the formal dignity of a bayonet. That ignorance is important because the corvo's greatest power was psychological before it was statistical. It changed what the enemy expected hand-to-hand combat to look like. Before any of that could matter on land, though the war had to become a land war at all. The early naval phase figures like Grau the Huáscar, the chase across the Pacific coast bought time, harassed Chilean logistics, and delayed the inevitable disembarkation. But the decisive struggle would occur in the nitrate desert, and the first major gate into that hell was Pisagua. Pisagua was in military terms a terrible place to assault, a natural fortress, sheer heights, fortified positions, crossed fire. The sort of coastal objective that punishes amphibious attackers mercilessly because they have to survive sea surf, sand, and elevation before they can even begin thinking about tactical order. On November 2nd, 1879, the Chilean landing craft lowered into rough water while Allied fire came down from above. Men were hit before their boots found bottom. Others were dragged under by the weight of equipment. Water and blood mixed at the shoreline. Under rational conditions, one expects attackers in that situation to flatten, seek whatever shelter the beach offers, return fire, reorganize slowly. But the transcript is correct to emphasize that something different happened. The men who reached shore did not behave like textbook amphibious infantry. They ran upward. That is the terrifying thing. Under direct fire, on loose sand that steals your footing. With every step they climbed toward the trenches, not because this was tactically elegant, but because closing distance was the only way the corvo and the kind of fighting they understood could begin working. The ascent itself was almost inhumanly difficult. Sand slipping under boots, hearts pounding against ribs, bullets and shells striking around them, hands needed to climb as much as to fight. And above them, the defenders watched these men come on not in beautiful formation, but in something closer to a pack. That image matters. Regular armies are frightening one way. Packs are frightening another. Once the Chileans reached the crest, the logic of 19th century firepower abruptly narrowed. The defender's rifle, so useful at range, became clumsy at intimate distance. A bayonet thrust needs line balance space. The corvo needed only contact. The first Chilean over the trench did not duel. He crashed into bodies. The blade hooked around rifles' necks, shoulders, bellies. The trench became a slaughter room. Officers trying to hold the defense watched their men not merely die, but be opened. Panic spread fast because this kind of violence is contagious at the level of imagination. One man throwing down his weapon after seeing what the blade does at 3 feet can infect a whole section faster than artillery ever could. Pisagua fell, and with it, the Black Legend was born. Medical officers examined wounds that no neat military manual had taught them to classify. The corvo was no longer an improvised rural tool. It had entered the war as a myth of terror. Yet Pisagua also planted the seed of Chile's first great land mistake, arrogance. Quick success at the coast encouraged the belief that the Allied forces inland were already cracked beyond meaningful recovery. That illusion marched the Chileans into Tarapacá in a state of physical torment and strategic overconfidence. The desert itself deserves more emphasis than most ordinary battle narratives give it because it acted as a constant accomplice to error. Men marched under unbearable sun carrying enormous loads. Water turned foul in barrels, tongues swelled, lips split. Hallucination moved alongside discipline. By the time the Chilean force approached the ravine at Tarapacá on November 27, 1879, it was already physiologically compromised. The Peruvian side, by contrast, had regrouped and used terrain intelligently. The ravine and surrounding heights were not a passive setting. They were a box. When the Chilean advance guard looked down and saw what seemed like a vulnerable camp, they mistook visibility for weakness. That misreading is what doomed the opening of the battle.
The blinding light masked their final trap.
The ambush was devastating. Fire poured from the heights. Rocks splintered under impact. Officers dropped before they could impose order. Units disintegrated into clusters of men, fighting for survival rather than parts of a coherent command structure. This is where the transcript reaches one of its most revealing turns. Once ammunition ran low, rational surrender might have seemed the only remaining option. But the Chileans did not move toward surrender. They moved toward the waist. Thousands of hands reached for the corvo. That sound, the metallic repetition of knives being drawn in place of cartridges, became its own sort of doctrine. No ammunition. Uphill enemy. Fortified positions. Charge anyway. On paper, it was suicidal madness. In psychological effect, it was something else. Peruvian soldiers looking downhill did not simply see defeated men making a final gesture. They saw exhausted, dusty attackers still willing to come to arm's reach when bullets had ceased to help them. Fear flipped. The Chileans took terrible losses, and in the end, Tarapacá remained a tactical setback for them. But psychologically, it changed the war again. The Allied camp now understood that even when surrounded, thirsty, and nearly out of ammunition, these men were still at their most dangerous within touching distance. That matters in later battles. Armies start carrying anticipatory fear from earlier encounters, and that fear does part of the later work. The war then hardened further under Manuel Baquedano, a commander whose brutal simplicity the transcript captures sharply. He was not the kind of intellectual strategist who wants elegant campaigns preserved in staff college memory. He wanted breakthrough by pressure. The objective became Tacna, where the Alliance held a powerful defensive position on high ground, supported by artillery and machine guns. This phase of the war reveals something fundamental about Chilean command culture. Once it accepted its own methods, it was willing to trade bodies for rupture, on the assumption that morale and hand-to-hand violence would finish what gunfire began. The march there was hell in itself, dust-failing boots bleeding, feet cold coastal fog giving way to killing sun. Then the attack came. The first lines were mowed down under concentrated fire. Men hugged the sand because standing meant immediate death. At such moments, many armies remain pinned and slowly dissolve. But among the reserves waited the battalions already associated with the corvo myth, the miners' laborers, men who had carried the blade through Pisagua and Tarapacá. Something in them snapped from fear into what the transcript calls ancestral fury. Whether one likes that phrase or not, it captures the emotional reality of battle, when disciplined endurance mutates into collective rage. The order to advance, once heard or half-heard, turned into a wave. They ran forward through machine gun and grape-shot fire, literally stepping over their own dead. The first men into the Allied redoubts did what they had done before. In cramped fortification space, the long rifle ceased to be king. The corvo ruled again. The trench mud turned red and slippery. Defenders saw what awaited them if the line broke, and often broke faster for that reason. Tacna ended in Allied collapse, and Bolivia practically shattered as a military partner was driven out of the war's active future, losing the road back to the sea forever. From there, the conflict moved toward one of its most mythic points, Arica. The Morro, that great rock height above the sea, was a natural fortress turned national altar by the determination of Francisco Bolognesi. His refusal to surrender his vow to burn the last cartridge matters because it framed the coming assault as a test of will rather than probability. The defenders were doomed in strategic terms. They knew it. The attackers knew it. Yet doomed positions can still kill fantastically if the approach is steep, mined, and narrow. The Chileans responded in the only way their command culture now truly trusted. No prolonged siege, no patient starvation. Shock, climb, and take it. The assault units included those already blooded in earlier horrors, and again the transcript emphasizes a crucial detail when mines exploded under them and the slope became a vertical wall of death. The damage did not stop the assault. It enraged it. They climbed faster. That tells you everything about how far the war had moved from civilized military self-image into something more primitive and direct. The summit fight lasted less than an hour. The aftermath descended into blood frenzy so severe that even Chilean officers struggled to halt their own men. This matters because it reveals the cost of cultivating such troops. The state had encouraged a style of killing that was extraordinarily effective in victory and increasingly difficult to switch off once surrender or control ought to have resumed. Arica was taken. But Chile also learned that the beast it had used so successfully did not always return calmly to the leash. One might expect the war to end there. Bolivia broken, Peru's southern armies shattered, the coast dominated. But logic, as the transcript says, had already died in the desert. Lima still stood, and for Chile to force a political end, it had to seize the capital. This required the largest amphibious movement in South American history up to that point, and led to the battles of Corrillos and Miraflores in January 1881. Here, the Corvo myth had moved ahead of the army itself. The city knew the stories. Civilians knew them. Soldiers knew them. Fear of the blade and the men who carried it had become part of the atmosphere before the battle even began. Yet, if Lima exposed the effectiveness of Chile's war machine, it also exposed its moral disintegration. Corrillos burned. Looting alcohol exhausted troops, vengeance class hatred, and war fatigue combined into a night of barbarity so severe that Chilean officers had to kill or threaten some of their own men to restore order. This is essential to keep in the narrative because it prevents easy, triumphal simplification. The Corvo and the fighting style around it did not simply win battles. They contributed to a culture of intimacy with violence that became increasingly hard to contain once formal resistance collapsed. The weapon and the men shaped by it were not clean instruments. They were corrosive ones. And still, the war refused to end neatly. Because Peru had one more kind of battlefield, Chile had not yet mastered the Andes. With Andrés Avelino Cáceres, the conflict entered its cruelest phase, the Breña campaign. Here, the Corvo, so dominant in desert assaults and trench fights, met a different universe. Thin air, freezing heights, narrow passes, indigenous communities, rolling stones, lances, slings, ambushes, and an enemy who understood the mountains as Pelayo had once understood Covadonga. Chilean troops who had seemed unstoppable in the nitrate desert now found themselves chasing smoke. Villages emptied before arrival. Water was poisoned or denied. Bridges were cut. Columns were attacked where terrain erased their advantages. This part of the story matters because it shows that no weapon remains universally supreme. The Corvo ruled when the distance collapsed. Cáceres worked constantly to prevent the war from settling into that distance. He stretched it through ambush altitude and disappearance. Chile needed a final decisive battle and found it at Huamachuco in 1883. There at high elevation, the Peruvian position initially looked promising. The Chileans attacked uphill and wavered. For a moment, it seemed Cáceres might achieve the impossible. But then came the old curse, again logistics. Ammunition ran out. The pursuit descended from secure ground into open slope. Once the Peruvians lost the ability to sustain fire, the Chileans reverted to what they knew best. Bayonets fixed close assault rupture through steel and bodily violence. Huamachuco destroyed the last meaningful Peruvian field resistance. Cáceres escaped, but no longer with an army that could continue the war in the same form. Military war gave way to political war. Peru, broken and divided, had to choose between endless resistance and negotiated mutilation. Under Chilean pressure and Peruvian division, Miguel Iglesias signed the Treaty of Ancón on October 20th, 1883, ceding Tarapacá permanently. Bolivia, not even invited to the final settlement, remained cut away from the sea. The map had been redrawn with knives, rifles, artillery, and starvation. But the transcript's most important and unsettling insight comes after the treaty. Because the war did not really end in human terms when the signatures dried. Chile returned home wealthier territorially, enlarged suddenly, a major Pacific power funded by nitrate revenue. Palaces, champagne, imported marble, public triumph, yes. But what does a country do with 50,000 trained or traumatized killers after the war is over? This is the question at the heart of the final act, and it is the reason the corvo matters beyond battlefield folklore. The Rotos, who had been indispensable in Pisagua, Tacna, Arica, Corrillos, and every nightmare in between, were thanked, decorated cheaply, and discarded. Many came home to nothing, jobs gone, bodies damaged, families dispersed, illness, alcoholism, begging, social contempt. The rich absorbed nitrate profits, the veterans absorbed memory. This is where the phrase Chile's payment becomes so bitter. The state that had needed the beast now feared him in peacetime. And the corvo returned with him, not to museums, not to clean glass cases of national glory, back to the waste under the poncho, into taverns, alleys, labor, violence, street killings. This is not incidental. It shows how war technologies and habits migrate inward once a society fails to reintegrate the men it armed. Violence learned in war rarely disappears on command. It seeks new work. Crime rises. Social fear changes target. The nation begins fearing its own veterans more than the foreign army they once defeated. In that sense, the corvo becomes the perfect symbol of a victory that poisoned the victor. A peasant tool turned war terror, turned veterans' last dependable companion in abandonment. Then came 1891, the Civil War. And here the story reaches its bleakest irony. The men shaped by the War of the Pacific, the men who had carried the corvo north and helped build Chile's new power, now killed one another for competing elites, for saltpeter wealth, for oligarchy, for Congress, for Balmaceda, for visions of the state that none of them had the luxury to debate from safety. At Concon Placilla and elsewhere, Chilean fought Chilean with a ferocity intensified by shared experience. The corvo came out again, not against Peruvians or Bolivians, but against countrymen. This is the final truth the transcript drives toward. With real force, the perfect killing machine created for external war eventually devoured the society that made it. War had taught these men that violence resolved the impossible. Peace did not teach them anything stronger. So, what finally was the corvo? A knife? Yes. A field tool? Yes. A symbol of Chilean trench ferocity? Yes. But more than that, it was a revelation. It revealed the class character of the war, that the poor fought it with their bodies, while the wealthy drank its profits later. It revealed how quickly civilized military self-images dissolve when terrain fear and close killing take over. It revealed the weakness of armies trained to imagine battle as orderly exchange when they face men who arrive inside the line already willing to brawl at the level of anatomy. And in the end, it revealed something even more lasting. No nation escapes the weapons it chooses if it refuses to reckon with the men who carried them home. The desert keeps the bodies. That is one of the most haunting images in the transcript, and one of the truest. In the Atacama, the dead do not vanish easily. They dry. They remain. Uniforms fade, but do not fully rot. Faces keep the shape of their last tension. The same can be said of historical memory. The War of the Pacific ended on paper. The Corvo did not. It remained in veterans' trunks, in whispered stories, in national shame, in border resentment, in class bitterness, and in the knowledge that Chile's rise as a Pacific power had been paid for by men who often died, poor, half-forgotten, or angry enough to turn their war inward. That is why the last image is not a victorious flag. It is the old soldier alone touching the blade one final time, feeling the war move again in his spine, and then putting it away because he knows better than anyone that steel like that never really sleeps. It only waits for a society desperate enough to need it again.